I leaned over the railing of the deck as our ship approached the infected coral. Even from at that height of the research vessel, I could see the blazing red algae cling to the reef like a parasitic blanket. The color was a mix of rust and blood. It stretched its limbs lazily in the tide. The overreach of the Red Death here to consume the marine ecosystem. Even the salt water smelled strange here. The ocean spray that drizzled on my cheek had an odor more like a foul vinegar. We'd gotten several reports of wildlife acting strange in the area, but most notably, the dolphins in particular. Their usual playful nature had turned aggressive. People down the coast were being attacked by them like never before. A man had even caught video evidence of a pod slamming their bodies against the hull of a cruise ship, like battering rams, until their brains ruptured from the repeated impact. No one had seen anything like it. I wasn't sure of the exact science behind the terrifying change in behaviors, but I knew for sure it had something to do with the invasive algae. We were here to study it, to find its nature of origin, and most importantly, to eradicate it. "Hey, Ben, that's an ugly son of a bitch, wouldn't you say?" Kyle, the master diver, called from below. "Oh yeah, she's ugly for sure. Looks angry," I replied. "Making everything else angry too, it seems. Reminds me of my ex-wife," he chuckled. "I don't know that anything could be as bad as Sheila," I laughed. "Isn't that the truth? Give me 5 and I'll be ready to collect your sample." Kyle scrambled to throw on his suit and diving gear as I checked over my notes. I was betting on the algae carrying some microorganisms that infected the brain, inflaming the amygdala, but I needed some samples to study back at the lab to be sure. "All right, preparing to dive. Captain, your approval, sir." Kyle sat on the edge of the railing, ready to submerge. I gazed up at the quartermaster. The broad shoulders of Captain Erickson engulfed the young lad from behind. He reached out a massive fist and gave the thumbs up. Kyle returned the gesture and situated his goggles, then flipped backwards over the railing and into the surf. The dive should have been textbook. 10 minutes in the deep and then out. Just enough to fit a few samples in a sandwich bag carved out from its dive knife. Then a quick ascension before spilling onto the deck. But it had been half an hour with no communication from his mouthpiece. The captain had even come down to the deck to pace the stern. He should be up by now, I thought, chipping an indentation on the clipboard with my thumbnail. Finally, there was a cry that crackled over the walkie relay system. We all sprinted to the port side, desperate to locate the diver. There was a blue expanse as far as I could see, with the hint of Red Death, but no Kyle. I started to panic. What if he got tangled up? What if he's trapped in the reef? I was about to grab my own diving gear to follow in after him before the cook, Jeremy, shouted, "There he is! Over there! Look!" We followed his finger, pointing off to the right side of the reef. Yellow oxygen tanks bobbled over the surface of the water, but he wasn't moving. The captain signaled for man overboard operations, and the entire crew scrambled to recover the diver. The quartermaster reversed the vessel as we readied the nets and pulleys. Once we were close to Kyle, A crane extended over the deck and dropped the net into the dark waters. We shifted our course to the left and dragged the net until the diver was scooped inside. The gears began to churn as we lifted out the water and dropped back into the ship. He fell with a thud, like a heap of mackerel on the trussels. The men quickly uncovered him from the netting and tore off his diving gear. He wasn't breathing. Pierre, the medic, started chest compressions. The entire crew fell silent as he pressed his palms on Kyle's chest in a rhythm before lowering his mouth to breathe into his lungs. I feared the worst. After no reaction from Kyle, after 4 minutes of this, had he died from such a simple dive? It seemed so unbelievable. He was a Navy diver that had undergone wartime operations after all. Suddenly, he spat water from his mouth and was overcome by a coughing fit as he expelled the ocean from his lungs. We all circled around him, and as soon as he came to, we all broke out into a cheer. "What the hell happened?" Captain Erickson silenced the celebration. I don't know," Kyle replied, as confused as anyone else. "Try," Captain demanded. "I was swimming towards a reef when the algae seemed to, it seemed to swarm me. It was as if it were alive, a mind of its own. It wrapped around me and slammed me against a coral." His eyes stared off into the sky as he explained. "Impossible," I whispered. "Did you get the sample?" Captain asked. "Yes, I got it." He held out a baggie of water. A red hunk of algae swirled around inside the plastic barrier as if it were trying to escape. "Good." Captain snatched it from his hand and tossed it to me. I caught the bag and watched as it swam inside. Algae shouldn't behave this way. It's unlike anything I'd ever seen. "Bad enough for you to study, Doc?" His large beard twitched in agitation as his stern gaze met mine. Yes, sir. That should be plenty," I replied. "Good. Everyone back to business as usual. Let's get the hell out of here and back to port." The captain sauntered back to his quarters as we all took back to our positions and turned the research vessel around. It was a 4-hour trip back to St. Medina's Marine Research Laboratory, and the sun was beginning to set. I placed the sample in a secure chest until we reached the port. The crimson tendril swimming this way and that way was too unsettling. I didn't want to hold it any longer. I ripped open a bag of chips for a snack just before a red strobing light spun in my cabin. "All hands on deck, all hands on deck," a robotic voice repeated over the intercom. I rolled off my bunk, threw on a t-shirt before storming through the hull of the ship. It had only been an hour since the dive. What on earth was going on? As I ascended the stairs, I heard screaming. Shrill cries for help reverberated through the steel passageways. "What in God's name?" I murmured as I crossed the deck. Jeremy, the cook, lay spread on the deck. He was eviscerated. His bowels gathered in a heap at his ankles as blood pooled in a pond around his skull. Bile rose in my throat as I fought the urge to vomit. I reached down to check his pulse with my fingers on his throat. Nothing. He was dead. I pushed the thought and the tears away from my head and rushed towards the quartermaster. I could hear cries for help from below in the living quarters as I ascended the steps to the helm. When I burst through the threshold, I saw 2 hands still gripping the wheel. They were torn from their root. Stephen, the quartermaster, sat crippled in the corner, his forearms a bloody ruin. His abdomen was hollowed out like a butchered calf. A cavern of meat and bone sat empty where organs and tissue used to remain. His eyes were rolled into the back of his head as if he were trying not to see what was happening to him. The whites bulged in their sockets as veins streaked across them. I did puke then. I couldn't help it. I retched onto the floor in 3 large heaves. As I was just about to scurry back down the stairs, the captain rushed up them. He barreled through the passageway and slammed the hatch behind him, nearly knocking me from my feet. "Captain, what the hell's going on?" I cried. "Kyle, he's gone mad." It was the first time I'd ever seen the captain show fear. He was normally so stoic, projecting strength and confidence. It was extremely unsettling to see him in this way. "What do you mean he's gone mad?" I asked. He wrapped thick fingers around my chin and turned my face to look out the glass over the deck. Kyle, the master diver, was hunched over in the moonlight, tearing meat from bone from the poor cook. Blood spurt from the body as he tore into the corpse like a hyena. "Oh my God," I whispered. I spun around and watched as a captain rifled through a drawer. "It has to be the algae. It must have invaded his brain, just like with the dolphins. What are we gonna do?" For once in my life, I was at a loss with no plan of action. "We're going to kill him." Captain Erickson pulled a large revolver from the desk and spun the cylinder before cocking back the hammer. "Okay, what can I do?" "You're the bait." He grinned at me as my heart sunk into my stomach. Kyle had left his meal of the cook's blade across the wooden boards and vanished somewhere below. The screaming had stopped, but I didn't think that was a good sign. I think that meant that everyone was already dead and there was no one left to scream. I slapped the soles of my boots across the hardwood noisily and began to whistle. It was the Marine Corps anthem that my grandfather had taught me as a child. I paced the bow, stomping wildly as patriotism escaped my lips as loudly as I could muster. I was almost done with the song before I heard Kyle scurry up the steel steps. He spilled out into the deck and paused, staring at me hungrily. His eyes were bloodshot. A red fungus had erupted through the pores of his skin. The algae had taken over and done the same thing to him it was doing to the marine wildlife. Hey, buddy, you good?" I asked shakenly. He just snarled and chomped his teeth together like a wild beast. The crowns of his molars snapped, and he lowered himself on all fours and arched his back, preparing to pounce. "Come on, Kyle. We're friends, remember? We both hate your ex-wife," I called out, but it was no use. Kyle was gone. Only a monster remained, one consumed by the Red Death. He rolled back on his heels before leaping through the air like a jungle cat. I folded my arms over my head as he soared towards me, There was no way I'd be quick enough to evade the attack. Just as he was about to collide with me, 2 shots rang out from the other side of the deck. The bullets struck Kyle from the side, causing him to falter and fall to the deck with a loud smack. He screeched and began to drag himself across the ship's surface, despite 2 large craters in his side. Captain Erickson strolled to his side and placed a large boot on his neck. Kyle chomped at his soul violently before the captain lowered the revolver to hover an inch above his forehead. "I'm so sorry, lad," he whispered before pulling the trigger multiple times, turning the master diver's head into a canoe of mush. We both stood at the side of our friend for a while. I was numb from what had happened, almost as if I were in shock and denial. Finally, the captain broke away to lean against the railing. He peered into the sky of stars for a long while before turning to face me. "You still have the sample?" he asked. Yes, I stuttered. "Good. Then these men won't die in vain." He turned back to face the endless ocean. I didn't know why the algae had caused such violence, how it was even possible, but I promised myself, for the sake of Kyle and the rest of the crew, that I would find out. And when I did, I'd be back to destroy it. The Red Death would die. It would never do this again, not if I had anything to say about it.